All right, welcome to Algebra, Section 1.5 and 1.6. Section 1.5 is all about adding and subtracting with integers. Integers, as you probably know, is whole numbers that could be positive or negative. And Section 1.6 is all about multiplying and dividing with those integers. So at this point, you've probably worked with adding and subtracting positive and negative numbers before. So rather than go over the same rules that you've probably been inundated with, we're just going to go ahead and kind of gloss over those a little bit. But I do want to hit the rules for multiplying and dividing. Those are a little bit easier. But at this point, if you're unsure of how to add and subtract with positive and negative numbers, we've got calculators. You're never not allowed to use your calculator. So just make sure you're good at using your calculator to do the adding and subtracting. So by the end of this lesson, you should be able to use adding and subtracting of integers for story problems. We will hit story problems. Multiply and divide with integers. Also use integers with exponents. So let's get to it. Let's start off with some story problems, some real life situations. So first thing we do when we see a story problem, you read it. So a mountain climber starts at an elevation of 23 feet above sea level. She climbs 120 feet, then descends 26 feet, climbs up another 300 feet up to a cliff that overlooks the ocean. She then jumps and drops 450 feet. What is her final elevation? So step one, you read it. Step two, you ask, what are we trying to find? And that's her final elevation. So after she does all this movement, where does she end up? Step three, you look back and see if you can find some other pertinent information. So the first thing it tells us is that they started at an elevation of 23 feet. So let's start there. Then it says she climbs 120 feet. So even though it doesn't say positive, the fact that she climbs, that indicates it's a positive 120, so plus 120. The word descends means to climb down, so we want to put a negative 26. And then climbs, so again, we're going up, so a positive 300. So after she gets to the top of this cliff, she then jumps, and of course when you jump, you fall down, so we're going to subtract 450. So then what's her final elevation? Well, we add all those up, plug it in on the calculator, and her final elevation is negative 33. So what does that mean when the elevation is negative? Well, 0 is sea level. So that means she's 33 feet below sea level. So at the end of this jump, she is 33 feet below the water. All right? Let's take a look at another example. A diver starts at 100 meters below sea level. He rises 23, then dives back down 80, then comes up 38 meters. What is his final depth? So again, we read it. We're looking for where does this diver end up? Let's start with all this information. We start below the sea level at 100 meters. So because it's below sea level, we're going to call it negative 100. Rises indicates that we plus 23, then dives back down. So because we're going down, it's a negative 80. Then comes up 39, so plus 39. Put those in the calculator, and we end up with negative 118. So that means he's 118 meters below sea level. You will see a couple questions like this on upcoming quizzes, so make sure you know how to set that up. Next skill I want to talk about is multiplying and dividing with integers, positive and negative numbers. Now I saw something a while back. It's this little chart right here. It looks kind of like a little tic-tac-toe chart. It's got plus signs down the diagonal, and everything else is negative signs. I like this little chart because no matter which way you read it, it's always true for multiplying and dividing negative numbers. So for instance, if I start at the top, a positive and a negative makes a negative. If I do the middle, a negative times a positive is a negative. And then a negative times a negative is a positive. And it doesn't matter which way you do it. If I do it up, down, whatever. So if I come right here, a negative times a negative is a positive. A negative times a positive is a negative. And a positive times a negative is a negative. So no matter what way you look at it, it's always true. So let's take a look at this. Negative 4 times 5. Well, 4 times 5 is 20. But a negative times a positive gives us a negative 20. And you can do that for all these problems. 6 times 3 is 18. And a positive times a negative is negative. 12 times negative 2 is 24. And because it's a positive times a negative, it's negative 24. Negative 5 times negative 3 is 15. But two positives make a negative. Or two negatives make a positive. So it makes a positive 15. Same goes for division. Negative 24 divided by 6 is 4. But because it's a negative then a positive, makes a negative 4. Positive 58 divided by negative 2 gives me a negative, 29? But what happens when you have something like this, where there's more than one number? All you have to do is just count the number of negatives. If there's an odd number of negatives, then your final answer is going to be negative. If there's an even number of negatives, then your final answer is going to be positive. So if I take a look across here, I'm not even going to look at the positives or negatives. I'm just going to do the numbers. So 3 times 4 is 12, times 2 is 24, times another 2 is 48. And then I'm going to count the negatives and see how many there are. So there's 1, 2, 3 negatives. So because there's an odd number of negatives, it's going to be negative 48. Final answer. Let's do the next one. 36 divided by 4 is 9. 9 times 3 is 27. 27 times 4 is 108. 108 times 2 is 216. Now let's go back and count how many negatives there are. So there's 1 there and 1 there. So even though it was a division problem, I still count how many negatives. Another one there, another one. So a grand total of 4 negatives. So because there's 4 negatives, each of those negatives cancels another one out. So it's going to be a positive 216. Piece of cake. All right, so let's apply that knowledge to exponents. So here I've got two problems that look very, very similar. Negative 3 to the 4th power and negative 3 to the 4th power. So the only difference is this one has parentheses and this one doesn't. So go ahead and work that out real quick and tell me what you think you got as the answer. I say tell me, but you'd be kind of silly if you're sitting there working on this by yourself and you're like, the answer's 81. All right. So yeah, don't tell me. Just kind of keep it to yourself. Let's go ahead and work it out together now. So let's use our knowledge of negatives and how they multiply in order to figure out the correct answer for this. So here I've got negative 3 to the 4th power in parentheses. So that exponent only affects what it's directly sitting on. So in this case, that 4 is directly sitting on negative 3, which means that negative 3 happens 4 times. So it literally means negative 3 times negative 3 times negative 3 times negative 3, which if we go ahead and multiply all the 3's, we get 81. There's 4 of them there, so since there's 4 negatives, it's going to be a positive 81. Now let's take a look at the other one without parentheses. Remember I said that exponents only affect what's directly sitting on. So this 4 is sitting on that 3, but because there's no parentheses, that negative is not included in the situation. So what happens is that 3 happens 4 times. That is an ugly 3. I'm just going to have to get rid of that. So the 3 happens 4 times, but that negative just drops down and happens once. So It's the difference between negative 3 times negative 3 times negative 3 times negative 3 compared to negative 3 times 3 times 3 times 3. So the number is still 81, but because the negative only happens once, it's going to be a negative 81. So in this case, whether it has parentheses or doesn't have parentheses makes a big difference in the answer. Let's take a look at another example and see how that holds true as well. So negative 5 to the third power without parentheses. So that negative just happens once, but the 5 happens 3 times. So 5 times 5 times 5 is 125. And that negative only happens once, so it's going to be a negative 125. Let's take a look at negative 5 to the third with parentheses. That literally means negative 5 times negative 5 times negative 5. So if I multiply all three of those, I still get the 125 number. But a negative times a negative times a negative still is negative. So in this case, I get the same number no matter what way I do it. All right? So don't get the idea that if it has parentheses, it's positive. If it doesn't have parentheses, it's negative. If it doesn't have parentheses, it's going to be negative. I'll give you that. But if it does have parentheses, whether it's positive or negative, depends on how many negatives there are. Okay? So don't be lulled into a false trap of if there's no parentheses, it's negative. If it does have parentheses, it's positive. Feel free to go ahead and write it out and figure it out each time. Let's do two more examples. If I do negative 4 to the third power with parentheses, that's negative 4 times negative 4 times negative 4. So 4 times 4 times 4 is 64. Count the negatives. 1, 2, 3. So a negative 64. Final answer. Last example. Here I have a negative already sitting outside the parentheses, so that negative just comes on down. And then the negative 2 happens 5 times. So negative 2, negative 2, negative 2, negative 2, 5 times. So multiply the 2 times 2 times 2 times 2 times 2, and that's going to give you 32. And then let's count the negatives. There's 1, 2, 3, 4. Matter of fact, I've seen some people do this. They look at it and say, okay, this negative and that negative cancel out. This negative and this negative cancel out. This negative and this negative cancel out. So it's a positive 32. If you want to actually go through and like cancel out the negatives, that's a great idea, a great visual to help keep things straight. Well, that's the main thing I want you guys to get from this is how to do word problems, how to do exponents with negatives, and how to do multiplying and dividing with negatives. So if you guys have any questions, feel free to email me or ask me in class, and I will see you guys real soon. Have a good one.